a thin gold band. Engraved on the inside, 3 letters and a year. IT 1914. My patient's wife had not seen that ring in 31 years. It had been wedged behind a hardcover set of Britannica encyclopedias on the 3rd shelf of a bookcase in a room her husband had not walked into in over a decade. I pulled it out with my left hand at 4:17 on a Saturday afternoon, approximately 18 hours after her husband died. He is the one who told me where to look. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Walter. He was 82 years old. I want to walk you through what happened exactly as it happened, not because you need to be convinced of anything, but because this is the kind of thing that only lands if you understand the clinical shape of it. And I am a nurse. The clinical shape is the only shape I know how to tell a story in. Walter had metastatic prostate cancer. By the time I took over his hospice shifts at his home in northeast Portland, the disease had reached his lungs and his spine, and he was in what we call the pre-active dying phase. He was obtunded most of the hours of the day. That's the clinical term for a depth of unresponsiveness beyond ordinary sleep, the kind where the patient still has reflexes, but their eyes no longer track, and their speech, when it comes, is a single-syllable murmur. He was cachectic. He had mottling beginning at his knees. He had Cheney-Stokes respirations, that ragged, uneven breathing pattern of a body that is shutting down the autonomic reflexes one by one. He was comfortable, thanks to the PCA pump delivering morphine on a steady basal rate. But he was no longer really present. His wife, Eleanor, was 79 years old, and she had been awake for 30 hours. She had been sleeping upright in the recliner next to his hospital bed for the better part of 2 weeks, leaving only to shower or warm up soup from the freezer their daughter had filled before flying back to Chicago. By that Saturday morning, Eleanor was at the point of exhaustion where her body was still upright, but her sentences were no longer quite connecting. I arrived for the mid-shift check at 11. I ran the numbers. Respiratory rate 12 and irregular. Oxygen saturation 88 on room air. Blood pressure low but stable. Mottling progressing up the lower legs. Skin cool and damp. He was going, I would have said, within 24 hours. I sent Eleanor into the kitchen to eat something while I bathed him. She protested, lightly, because by that point she didn't have the energy to protest heavily. And then she went. I could hear her moving a plate across the table very slowly, the refrigerator door opening. The quiet dignity of a woman who had forgotten how to eat but was going to try. And then Walter opened his eyes. I want to describe this as precisely as I can because I have thought about it for years. He didn't open them the way a half-conscious patient opens them. That unfocused slide that sometimes happens during repositioning, where the lid lifts, but the gaze is somewhere 50 miles behind the face. That isn't what happened. He opened his eyes all the way. He turned his head toward me. His pupils tracked and converged. He looked at me the way a completely lucid person looks at another person, with recognition, with intention, and with the full weight of a mind behind the gaze. He had not looked like that in 9 days. "Grace," he said. I had told him my name on my first shift. I had not been sure he had processed it. I felt the back of my neck go cold. "Walter, hi. You're doing okay." He shook his head very slightly. "Listen to me. I want to pause here because there is a phenomenon in the medical literature that this is going to connect to, and you need it in hand to understand what followed. It's called terminal lucidity. A German biologist named Michael Nahm compiled the first systematic modern survey of it. He published a paper in 2009 in the Journal of Near-Death Studies and followed it with additional work in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease that same year. Nahm had gathered case reports reaching back almost 200 years, pulling them out of clinical journals and memoirs and letters, cases where patients in advanced dementia, in end-stage brain disease, in deep obtundation from metastatic cancer, patients who by every neurological measure should no longer have been capable of coherent interaction, suddenly, briefly, became themselves again. Minutes, hours, sometimes a single afternoon. They recognized family members they had not recognized in years. They spoke in full, ordered sentences. They remembered. They said the things they had needed to say. And then they were gone. Nahm found that the majority of these episodes, over 80%, occurred within a week of the patient's death. A striking percentage happened in the final day of life, and nobody in any of the papers he surveyed could account for it mechanistically. There is no known neurological model that predicts function restored in brains that are, by every available measure of imaging and electrical activity, no longer structurally capable of function. What Nahm wrote, and what other researchers working in the same area have continued to write, is that we do not know what this is. We have observed it. It happens. It is documented repeatedly in hospice and palliative settings. And the bedside nurses who have seen it tend to carry a particular kind of silence about it afterward, because it doesn't fit inside the language we are trained to use about brains and deaths and the relationship between them. Walter was in a terminal lucidity episode. I did not know that word yet in 2014 when this happened. I just knew what I was looking at. A man who had been gone for 9 days, back in the room, looking directly at me with the full intensity of a mind that still had something to do. He had my complete attention. "Tell Eleanor," he said, "the ring is behind the bookshelf." I started to ask which ring. He kept talking. "In the back room, 3rd shelf, behind the encyclopedias. It slipped when I was moving them. I don't know when. It must have been 30 years ago. I couldn't find it. I told her I'd lost it. I told her it was gone. Grace, it's not gone. It's behind the books. Tell her." I wrote down what he said, word for word. I write fast. 22 years of chart notes will do that to you. Promise me. I promise. He closed his eyes. His head settled back onto the pillow. His respirations resumed their irregular pattern. When Eleanor came back from the kitchen 10 minutes later, I did not tell her. I did not know what to tell her. I stood in that room watching the numbers on the monitor and thinking about every patient I had ever nodded at politely when they had tried to tell me something I had already decided wasn't real. Walter died at 11:40 that night. Eleanor was holding his hand. I stayed an extra hour after the family pronounced. I helped the funeral home people with the paperwork. I stood with Eleanor at the door when they took him out under a blue sheet. I made her tea that she didn't drink. I could not leave without asking about the ring. I want to tell you what her face did when I said the words, and I also want to tell you that I'm not going to try very hard, because I have thought about it for years, and I still don't have the language for it. She was standing in the kitchen with her back to me, looking out the window at the early winter dark. When I said, as gently as I could, "Eleanor, before he passed, Walter asked me to tell you something," she turned around, and when I repeated the specific phrase, "the ring behind the bookshelf in the back room," something went out of her face and something else came into it, and she sat down in the kitchen chair without looking behind her to find it. She found it because she knew exactly where it was. "Grandma Ida's wedding ring," she said. She told me that the ring had belonged to her maternal grandmother, Ida Thorvaldsen, engraved on the inside with her initials and the year she was married, IT 1914. That Walter had worn the ring on a chain under his shirts for the first 10 years of their marriage because his hands were too big for the band and Eleanor had not wanted to alter the original engraving. That in the early 1990s, during a remodel, the ring had disappeared. That Walter had searched, that she had searched, that they had torn their own house apart for weeks, that Walter had eventually sat down across from her at that same kitchen table with tears in his eyes and told her he must have lost the ring during the renovation, that she had forgiven him, that they had never spoken of it again in more than 3 decades. "The back room," she said. "Yes." "The bookcase, the encyclopedia shelf." "Yes." She stood up and walked to that room without saying anything else. I followed. The back room had been Walter's home office before the cancer made stairs impossible. The bookcase took up the entire west wall. The third shelf held a matched leather-bound set of the Encyclopedia Britannica, volumes A through Z. Eleanor told me quietly that he had bought them at an estate sale the year they were married. I pulled out the first volume. Nothing. The second. Nothing. I went through every single one. In the narrow space behind the volume labeled Pal Pet, where the shelf board had warped very slightly over the decades and created a gap of maybe half an inch between the backs of the books and the paneling, I saw something catch the light. A thin gold band, 3 letters engraved on the inside, IT 1914. I handed it to Eleanor in the doorway. She held it in both hands for a long time. Then she said, and I want to be careful repeating this, because it is not an explanation. It is just what she said to me in that doorway. He knew I was afraid. He knew I would be afraid of whether he was still anywhere at all. He used his last clear minutes to give me something I could touch. Peter Fenwick is a British neuropsychiatrist, emeritus consultant at the Maudsley Hospital in London, a man with a very long career in clinical neurology, who, late in that career, turned his attention to what nurses and hospice workers had been watching at bedsides for as long as there had been bedsides. In 2008, he and his wife Elizabeth published a book called The Art of Dying. It is built on data from over 100 hospice carers across 3 countries, England, Holland, and a hospice study in Ireland, and more than 1,500 further accounts that came in after the research was publicized. What Fenwick documented in that book, and what I want you to hear clearly, is that roughly 60% of patients in hospice settings experience some form of pre-death phenomenon. Visions of deceased loved ones arriving at the bedside. Reports of the dying person seeing into a space the caregivers cannot see. Moments of terminal lucidity, exactly like the one I had with Walter. And within that data, there is a specific subcategory, smaller than the others, but consistent and recurring, of dying patients communicating verifiable information that could not have been guessed at, constructed, or confabulated from the material available to them. A location, a name, an object whose existence had been hidden even from the surviving spouse. Fenwick is not a mystic. He is a neuropsychiatrist writing within a clinical tradition that trained him to be suspicious of exactly these kinds of reports. He did not go looking for a belief system. He went looking for what was actually happening at bedsides, across enough hospices and enough carers that he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. He published what he found. I read The Art of Dying 6 months after my own cardiac event in 2019, the one I've talked about in other videos, the surgery that went wrong, the 3 minutes and 14 seconds of a systole in that operating room, the anesthesiologist whose words I repeated back to him when I woke up. I read Fenwick's book with the clinical defensiveness I had carried for 22 years and had only begun to lose after my own experience. And when I reached the chapters on verified deathbed communication, I put the book down and went into my kitchen and cried in a way I had not cried in a very long time. Because I'd already been in Walter's room. I had already pulled that ring out from behind a row of books placed there more than 30 years earlier. I had already written a sentence on a hospice chart in my own handwriting, 5 years before it had any place to fit in my understanding of the world. I want to tell you the thing I most want you to hear. After I came back from my own cardiac arrest in 2019, there was a specific fear that took months to leave me. It wasn't the fear of dying. It wasn't, strangely, even the fear of pain. It was the fear that if death is a door, the door only opens one way. That I could go through, that they could go through, but nothing could pass back. I was afraid that when my mother died, 2 decades before my own event, and I had not been in the room with her, I was afraid she had not been able to reach me. I was afraid my patients, the hundreds I had sat with in those last hours, had not been able to reach the people waiting in the hallway. I was afraid that the bridge only ran in one direction, and that the silence I had been calling clinical was, in fact, silence. Walter and Eleanor are the reason I do not believe that anymore. I know a single case is not a study. I know the plural of anecdote is not data. I know exactly what a clinician is supposed to say and what she is not supposed to say. But I can tell you, as the person who wrote that sentence down with a ballpoint pen on a hospice chart, and as the person who pulled a thin gold ring out from behind a row of books that a dying man had directed her to, the bridge runs in both directions. Walter used his last clear window to cross it. If you are someone who has lost a spouse, a parent, a partner, and the silence where they used to be is the hardest thing you are carrying right now, I cannot promise you a ring behind a bookshelf. I cannot promise you any specific sign, any particular confirmation. Nobody honest can promise that, and I am not going to start now. What I can tell you is that I have watched, more than once, something cross a space we have all been told is uncrossable. Sometimes it comes as a dream that is too specific to be a dream. Sometimes as a phone call from a stranger who knew them. Sometimes as a ring you thought you would never see again, appearing in the hands of a nurse standing in your kitchen at 5 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. I am not asking you to believe any of that. I am telling you I was there. Eleanor Hendricks wore the ring every day for the 11 months she lived after Walter. She was buried with it. I know that because her daughter wrote me a letter after the funeral. She enclosed a copy of a photograph, her mother's hands, folded in her lap, taken 2 days before she passed. The ring is visible on her left little finger, where Eleanor had worn it because her own knuckles no longer allowed her to put it on her ring finger. The daughter added a single line at the bottom of the letter. She wasn't afraid. I kept that letter. I kept the page from the hospice chart where I wrote down Walter's words. I kept both of them in the same file folder in the drawer of my desk for the days when my clinical training creeps back up my spine and starts whispering that I must have misremembered something. I didn't misremember. He told me where it was. It was there. Take care of each other.